This is designed to kind of give you a basic introduction to what ports do and where ports are going. And it's a compendium of kind of lectures we've talked about over the years. So we're going to give you an overview of the legal structure and the powers, your role as a commissioner and as a member of the commission, and then the role of the executive director, which Les can tell you about. We'll tell you some legal stuff you probably should know if you're going to be a port commissioner, and provide a perspective on what port attorneys should do for you so that you know what you have. And then some non-legal thoughts on being a successful commissioner. And our firm represents about 50 fire districts around the state, several PUDs, a couple cities. So we've been to lots of meetings and see things go incredibly wrong with sheriff's deputies in attendance and things like that. And hopefully none of that will ever befall you. So let's look at port powers. The ports were first established in this state in 1911. Does anybody know why? It was an idea to blunt the impact of the railroads. The railroads had moved into Washington. The Weyerhaeusers had moved into Washington. They were taking up all of the waterfront along the state. There was a great concern that our state would be owned by the railroads. And so they were formed in 1911 as transportation-based governments. And kind of remember that. Systems of harbor improvements, rail, water, transfer, and terminal facilities. So you can picture back in 1911, that was what was going on in Bellingham, in Tacoma, in Everett, in Vancouver, in Longview. All across the state, there was rail, water, transfer, and terminal facilities. But what's happened is the ports have been remarkably successful. So you join a long list of commissioners that have been very successful. And my view is the legislature goes to the ports when it needs something done. Okay, goes to the ports when it needs something done. Does anybody know how many ports are in the United States? Guess? About 150. Okay, how many are in the state of Washington? Fully half of the ports in the United States are in this state. So really, if we were to be honest, we would say they are economic development authorities. Okay, they're economic development authorities. So, and the powers led by the WPPA, led by you commissioners who come up with ideas, have evolved over time to meet the needs of your port district. And so that's a big point. I could tell you kind of the 5 most important points in this talk, but then we'd have like an hour before the reception. So we'll go through them. But that is one of the important points, is powers evolve to meet your needs as commissioners, to reflect your community.
Do you mind if I jump in for just a second?
Sure.
on that? So that idea of the ports owning the access to the water for free flow of goods is still important today on making sure that commodities are flowing without discrimination, that you have those commodities flowing. That was the basis of Everett's condemnation, for example, of Kimberly-Clark property, was that, and that was the point that won out with the public when they realized that, okay, that's going to be in public ownership and you're going to have a free flow of commerce going. It's extremely important.
So, traditional port activities, acquisitions and operations, and if you look there, I said 1911, that's when that statute was passed. 5308, that's Revised Code of Washington. 53.08, if you Googled RCW 53.08, it would provide that to you. And I recommend you read that as a port commissioner. You know, if you have you're up late, can't go to sleep. It's not a very long statute, 5308, and then look at 020. So in the law, Title 53 is ports, 08 is powers, and 020 was the first power they gave ports. And as you go down, we're down to about 2.45. There's about 15 or 20, maybe 30 of these, and you can read them. So originally it was seawalls, jetties, wharves, docks. You could just imagine. And then the wide open improvements related to industrial and manufacturing activities. Okay, so that was pretty broad back then. Many ports formed in the early 20th century. Here's from where we lived, the Bellingham Herald. Hart was leading Hartley in a landslide for the port project. Okay, so our first port was Port of Seattle, Port of Grace Harbor, Vancouver, Port of Bellingham in 1920. Okay, The next thing in 47, so things kind of bounced along, and I'm not giving you every port power. We have a talk about that, we do. Things kind of bounced along until World War II, and then things started to really accelerate for ports, okay? Because the legislature wanted to make something happen in this state. And we had an extraction economy, right? We had lumber, fishing. We did some boat building as a result of World War II. And so they started to say, well, the first thing we're going to allow ports to do is studies, investigations, and surveys of what we could do to get industrial development in a port district. And they were very careful. You couldn't run a dairy farm, okay? For some reason, the people got in there and said, but no dairy farms for ports. And in 1955, they allowed you to create industrial development districts. And this is a very confusing area for ports. Basically, you can create a geographic area that's called an industrial development district. You have to find that the lands inside of it are marginal. And once you create a geographic area, then you can acquire property by purchase and condemnation. You can plan and redevelop the property. You can sell the property. You can do an LID to your neighbors inside the industrial development district. And so think of the power they gave the ports in 1955 and said, listen, you can think of 55. We have old industrial property. They wanted the ports to step in and get things organized, right? But by 1965, times were changing in Washington, and all of a sudden, ports could develop parks. Now, if you go back to 1911 and think about jetties, seawalls, shipping facilities, industrial facilities, now we're into the park business. And it was related to port facilities, and it had to be approved by local county or city. So of the ports you guys are stepping up to represent, how many have a park? There's lots of parks, and guess what? There's now demands for parks that ports put parks in waterfront access. Well, by 1984, Washington's changing. I came to Washington in 1982 as a young Army officer. And things were changing. You already saw kind of the decline in logging, industrial activities. Everybody discovered Washington, a great place. And so now ports were given authority to do tourism promotion and tourism-related facilities. So now all of a sudden, the ports throughout the state are doing tourism promotion. Compare that then to jetties, wharves, and industrial developments from years gone by, okay? Now, some of this is driven by the WPPA. The Washington Public Ports, goes to the legislature and says, we have an idea. We think this would be good for our community. And some of it's, frankly, driven by the legislature. We would like more of this. Who could do this? And ports are invariably tapped to help out in various things. Okay? Economic development in 1985. Okay? We can engage in programs of economic development. Now, if you think about two statutes that you want to know, it's 5308-255 on tourism and economic development programs. Okay, and that was just recently expanded to provide for workforce training. So we now can do workforce training. Why? Well, if you've been involved in watching Washington, there's a big need for workforce training. Ports can now, it's very clear, can do workforce training. So wholesale telecommunications in 2000. Ports got on board and said, boy, the internet, that's kind of taken off. We would like to have that in our port districts. And so the legislature allowed ports to get into the wholesale telecommunications business. Right now there's an interlocal agreement of ports along I-5 to develop a fiber network down the I-5 corridor to reach to their ports. And in 2003, cooperative watershed management and environmental is growing. People want things done. So now ports can engage in cooperative watershed management. But I must tell you that you still are what's called a special purpose municipal government. It's also called a Dillon. People sometimes call it a Dillon jurisdiction. That's from a case in Virginia called Dillon. So you have very broad powers subject to future definition. And I always tell people, if there's a project, there usually is a power. And we're going to tell you how you get to the power from your project, okay? And there probably are limits. I once represented a fire district in a rural area that had, we still represent them, that had a health clinic, because there was no health clinic in the area, so they opened a health clinic in their fire station. And it was great. People could go get health care. The justification was the EMTs would get training to be an EMT. They'd learn how to do that. And the auditor said you can't do it. So now there's a law. You can have a health clinic in a rural port district or rural fire district, so long as it's bounded 3 sides by water and the 4th side by the Canadian border. If your fire district matches that description, you can have a health clinic. Point Roberts. Okay? So ultimately, and Les can weigh in, ultimately this is analysis of the statutes and appetite of the commission to define the bounds. Let me tell you one thing about lawyers, okay, just to get up front. How many of you have worked regularly with lawyers before you took this job? If you know, we're lawyers, we're kind of super smart, okay, and we can run anything. If you don't believe us, just ask us. We'll tell you that. So one of the important things to understand is your lawyers give you legal advice. It's not the business advice, okay? The lawyers say, this is the legal advice. It's up to your business decision. The lawyers like to mix in their business decision because we're so smart, so we like to tell you, no, you can't do this, you should do it this way, you should do it that way. With all due respect to my colleague Les, who's an admiral, 1-star, I worked for a 2-star general, or 3-star general in the Army, and he would say, they'd call you judge, and he'd say, Judge, your job is not to tell me what I can't do. Your job is to tell me how to do what I want to do, okay? As long as we're clear on that point, Judge, and yes, General, I'm pretty clear on that, and so think of your lawyers as help facilitate discussion, but ultimately the referee is the state auditor. They'll come in and decide if you've pushed the envelope too far on your port powers, right? Too far on your port powers. Les, you have any comment on that?
Yeah, just as Frank said, it's legal advice. It's advice. But what the lawyer does is understands what's your intent, where is it you're trying to go, what are the left and right limits that you have on that, and how do they get you to where it is you want to go in a legally compliant manner, and then help you identify what those risks are that go through so you can make an appropriate decision. So identify the risk and what are the mitigating approaches to that risk to do that, and then ultimately the commission is the decision maker on it because you're the one setting it. So that's the role that we play in helping you come to that decision.
And I'm struck by the fact that people ask me, I've represented ports a long time, how do you do that? And I say, because I know one thing to be true. When the 3 commissioners or 5 commissioners vote, or 6 commissioners vote, it's the right decision. And you may say, well, what if it's the wrong decision? No, it is, by definition, the correct decision. The body politic is spoken, and our job as lawyers is to help. Now, if it's obviously something illegal, we're going to write you a memo and say you're all going to go to prison. But but absent that, we have a duty to support it. We don't get to say it's a bad idea. Okay, it's a bad idea. We want to hear. You want to hear from us before whether it's a bad idea. But if you listen and say, okay, we got it, but we're going to go forward. I've had commissions say, we don't care if we get an audit finding. It's a really great idea. We disagree with the auditor. So I wouldn't recommend that, but okay. So it may be a great idea, but there at least needs to be an arguable legislative authority. So we can help you get to yes. That's what we do. But don't let us make the business decision. We can identify legal support for the idea. Remember I told you an important statute, economic development? What is it that we do that doesn't somehow relate to economic development? I mean, if you made a finding that a park would help with economic development, it's very difficult to get beyond. Economic development's a lot. Commercial development, trade and tourism, industrial development, promotion of economic health in the community. We don't know where the edges of those envelopes are, right? And so we are always telling you, let's build the case on the front end and identify risk mitigation. Ultimately, it becomes a business decision for the port.
And that's where your attorney can help you frame that. So what are those findings that you need to make? How do you properly document those to preserve the record in case you do get a challenge? What kind of people do you want to have come talk to you about those things like the park? There are there are consultants out there that will come and say, okay, here's how a park can attract jobs and businesses to this area and those kinds of things. So there are ways to do it, and that's where your attorney can come in and help you develop that.
And quite frankly, what we're arguing against is you haven't had the pleasure of meeting the auditor. Some of you, Julie has from the Port of Anacortes. The auditors are humorless 24 and 25-year-old accountants. And they come to your office and you say, you want a cup of coffee? We couldn't take coffee. We would be, that would be like trying to influence us. And they sometimes read stuff and go, we think this is a violation. We say, what's your basis? Well, we just do. So I tell people I have 2 grown sons. I tell them what the teachers used to say in junior high. Show your homework, show your work. You have to show your work, commissioners. This is a very important thing. If you're going to make a decision, then have the record show the justification in the statute for your decision. You know, so let's say you want to build something, you bring in people to testify, it's going to, use your example, park, it's going to get tourism, and the local people and, experts testify. Then when the auditor comes in and says, well, I don't think this is right, say, well, what do you know? I mean, we had all these experts and the commission made a decision, and that usually will carry the day. Okay, so in the absence of showing your homework, then what happens is you open the door for the auditors to substitute their judgment for yours. Let me give you some actions that may not exactly match the port statutes. These are all true cases. Construct a swimming pool. Well, there's going to be swim meets that are going to come to town, and the hotels are going to fill up. And the fishermen can put on their life-saving gear and jump in and out of the pool and learn how to don their gear. So I tell you that story because in Bellingham, they had a Let's Pool Together about 30 years ago, and it came down to they were $150,000 short. So they came to the port. Why'd they come to the port? Anybody? Port has money. Good place to go. Government with money will show up and ask for some. And I was a young lawyer, and they said, you got to justify this. And I'm like, well, this is a stretch. But we had all this testimony, but we were saved from the auditor because a 40-year port commissioner, so how many of you plan to serve 44 years? 40-year port commissioner raised his hand, Pete Zawanich, and he said, when I first started being a port commissioner, they gave me a check every month, And I didn't cash the checks, and they called me and said, Pete, you're screwing up the books. You're not cashing the checks at the port. We need you to put them in the bank. So there was a new bank in town, and Marie was his wife, she sat in the back and knit at every port meeting. Marie and I put it in a local bank, and I've never spent any of the money, and I've been a port commissioner, I think then 42 years. And he said, it got more and more and interest and all that, and he said, so we got $150,000 in that account, we'll donate it to the pool. So, port commissioners, if you save your port commission dollars over the next 40 years, you can have some money. So, but operate an ice arena, there's port does that. Donate money to charities is a red flag, right? It's donative intent. So people always ask, what's gifting of public funds? Gifting of public funds means you have a donative intent, okay? There's no government purpose. Some things are on the line, and you can establish the government purpose, and if the ancillary benefit to a nonprofit, that's okay. Provide free speech for good causes. That's a trick question. It's good causes, that free space for good causes. It can't be good causes. It has to be a policy of free space. Collect residential garbage. You would think, well, what port would do that? Anybody here from the Port of Lopez? The Lopesians have a long history of a community place where they would bring their garbage and they would all meet. The Lopesians meet on Saturdays and they sort through stuff and they trade things that could be traded. And San Juan County decided, well, wait a minute, what we're going to do is we're going to have a garbage truck go around and pick up the cans, the green cans. And Lopesians said, this is horrible. The only two governments on Lopez Island are the fire district, which is all volunteer, and the port district, which runs the airport. They came to the port district and said, how about you run the transfer station? Okay. And the arguments were, people ride bikes around Lopez Island. It's a tourist attraction. If you have garbage cans out there, it doesn't look good. all those kind of things. What happened was San Juan County formed a municipal solid waste district, and now they tax themselves to have the privilege of going and dumping their garbage on Saturdays at the transfer station. Provide preferential local contracting opportunities. That's going to be very difficult. Discounted mortgage to locals, difficult, particularly if you have Corps of Engineer money that went into your facilities, because the Corps precludes you from discriminating against any American citizen, maybe Canadians. If you're Port of Bellingham or Port Edmonds, you might be able to discriminate against Canadians, but not Americans. Do you discriminate against Canadians? Did they at the Port of Everett?
With findings.
Okay. Bulk build parks. This is a new one, and maybe we can have a short discussion. A number of ports have been approached by providing homeless shelters or low-income housing. Okay, new thing. Why? Anybody? Why ports would be approached? And you have land. And you have land. So the argument is one of economic development, right? That it's important for our society. It leads to a more healthy economy. It, maybe trade and tourism. We need the downtown. Please, people go stay. But these are issues that you're going to have to confront in your terms. You're going to have to think about how the port powers expand, okay? And I was talking to one new port commissioner. The whole idea, I think, of telling your constituents, that's not what we do, is difficult to swallow. I don't think that'll hunt. I don't think that dog will hunt. I think, why not? So I think you have to look at it and say, maybe we're not the appropriate agency. We can partner with a city. There's something else here. We provide efforts in this regard. And your port attorney can help you, because if maybe you get an opinion from your port attorney, you can't do it.
The common denominator through all this is what's your intent? As a commission, what's your intent? What is it you're trying to accomplish? Articulating that, and then these become the implementing things that you're trying to do to accomplish that intent. And then that helps where we can then try to pull that together and provide a justifiable record to show what that intent is.
Okay, so bringing a new idea to life. How many of you are elected because you have a new idea? Anybody? Okay. Yeah, a couple new ideas. Very important commissioner skill. And I'm going to turn this over to Les, because you ask your port staff first, how can we get this done? As opposed to bringing it up in a meeting in front of the public.
So what I'd recommend is that you sit down with your executive director, again, identify what your intent is. What is it that you're trying to accomplish? Essentially the why of what it is that you want to do. And then that kind of sets the end state. What is it that ultimately I want this to look like? Why are we doing this? And then what the executive director can do is put staff resources to that to say, okay, here's what we're going to try to come up with various options to get there. And through that refinement process of identifying options, then you start looking at, okay, what are the pros and cons? What are the risks that go along with each of those? And then how do you mitigate those risks to try to reach that end state? As we've been talking about, be prepared to articulate what is that public good? How does it tie back to what your statutory authorization and powers are? But then the executive director can keep coming back to that. One of the things that I would point out, and we'll talk about in a little bit, is that the commission acts as a collective group. So if you're going to put monetary resources and those kinds of things together, you need to have a discussion. But you can sit down initially with the executive director and say, okay, here's kind of what I'm thinking. What do you think? How do we develop a plan of action on that? And then, that allows you to then have some thought to that process when you come back to the commission as a whole to say, here's where I want to go, here's what I want to accomplish, and here are some ideas.
And likewise with your port attorney, you can say, hey, I have this idea, what do you think? And if the attorney says, well, it's not legal, and he or she says, you say, why? And they say, well, because I'm an attorney and I'm telling you it's not legal. You can understand this stuff. I don't know if you know this, but all lawyers, when we went to college, we wanted to be doctors. First thing. We took freshman biology or zoology, and we got our grade and said, ooh, that's not too good. Got to do something different. I'm not going to medical school. Chemistry's beyond me. So we became lawyers. So it's not that complicated. Your lawyer should be able to explain to you why it is that you can't do this, or at least the business risk, okay? Now, we're going to talk about the role of commission and the commissioners. So I'll turn that over to Les. How do you fit into the big structure, and then what's the role of the commission, which is super important, okay?
So the first bullet that you see there is essentially what we were talking about, is that the commission acts as a collective body. Individually, the commissioners can have ideas and so forth, but to get the Port Commission to act, you have to have the collective body act together to do that. There is also what the commission needs to be aware of is to be careful, particularly a 3-member commission. If you talk to another commissioner, you're violating the Open Public Meetings Act. So you've got to be careful with that. But that's where talking to the executive director to bounce ideas off of, because you do need that flexibility and capability to just bounce ideas, have some of those crazy thoughts, and kind of talk through it. And that's where the executive director can do that. And also for those of you that do have a port attorney, that's somebody else who has seen quite a bit of things going on and can help you kind of structure your ideas on that.
Now, some ports have, at least a number of ports have a topic at the end of their agenda just called new business or commission discussion, where you can, how many are in 3-member commissions? Most of you, yeah? Where you can talk to the other commissioners. Hey, I have a general idea. Now, you got to be a bit careful because it's just, you've already talked to the ED. I'd like to raise an issue with you. I think maybe we should consider going in this direction. And each commissioner can go around and raise a new business topic as a way to talk about something. So talk to your executive directors about that and make sure that your commission agenda meets your needs. If you're a commission that you joined up because you think they're doing things well and you want to keep doing them, then maybe that's not important. If you have some new ideas, you have to have a method to bring that forward to the other commissioners.
Yeah. And then what that allows you to do is then the commissioners can talk together at the open meeting and say, yes, we want to apply staff and financial resources to take a look at this problem. ED, here's kind of what we're trying to accomplish. Here are the appropriate resources to do this. And that'll also stimulate a discussion about, did you adequately budget for it, or do we need to find money to be able to do this because it pops up in the middle of the year or something of that nature. So it provides that ability to talk through those things. So this lays out the commission's authority in state law. The main things on the powers are you elect a president and a secretary. One of the big things that would recommend is that you do adopt a resolution governing the transaction of business. What are those business rules that you're going to do? And many ports already have those in place. But it provides that common denominator for resolving issues at commission. So you're going to follow Robert's Rules of Orders. You're going to allow telephonic meetings, and there's some rules that go along with it. But it allows those things so that there's a common playing field there that everybody knows what they're working with. The other powers that the commission has: appoint the executive director, and we'll talk a little bit about that interplay between the commission and the executive director.
Now, some ports, we do a presentation because, Jerry, I don't know if you know, but there's about a half a dozen ports that have no staff. It's just 3 commissioners. And I don't know if any of you are from those ports, but they have no staff, just 3 commissioners. And they typically run a boat launch or something like that. And the commissioners pitch in and run it together, and they're the elected officials. So I think there's about a half dozen, maybe, small ports, something like that.
And there's a small ports seminar that goes on that delves down into some of those issues that are more applicable to the small ports. Obviously, setting the budget, making sure that you have the budget adopted. Annually appointing the port auditor and the port attorney. That happens each year. And then recommend that there's a delegation of authority to the executive director, again, setting that baseline of here's what authority we're delegating down to the executive director to implement what those authorities are. And then the ED then knows what their intention or what their capabilities are to be able to implement.
One thing, I said look at chapter 5308. The other document you want to look at is you want to read the delegation of authority. You want to know what authority has been given to staff. okay, and whether you agree with that. Because annually, some ports annually look at that. And there's huge variations. Some executive directors can approve a lease for less than a year. Other executive directors have up to 5 years, which, you know, is a remarkable spread. What was your lease authority in Everett?
A year under.
A year.
Yeah.
So, so see what authority, and when you get different executive directors, you can narrow that or expand that, but that's your principal delegation, okay? So you should all know what that one looks like.
And it's a best practice to take a look at that and decide, because laws change, for example, and you want to make sure that you're complying with those. So it's good idea to keep checking on those. So staff support for the commission. So the executive director is the individual that you appoint as the commission, and essentially what that person does is they're kind of the go-between between the commission at the strategic level and staff at the tactical level. And so they're kind of going back and forth between. They're also a good opportunity for you to have somebody working on helping you at the strategic level. What is the strategy the port is trying to implement? What are you trying to accomplish as a port? And then that individual can provide advice to you about, okay, what are the resources that would go into that? What are the priorities that are already out there? Are there conflicting priorities that go with that? What are the budgetary ramifications that come along with those things, and help you prioritize in that? So it's good to have them part of that strategic team. And also, it's good for the executive director to be able to tell you, hey, the executive director and staff are not going to try to influence you one way or the other. They're going to present facts to you. They're going to present what are the pros, the cons, the risks, mitigation, those kinds of things, but recognizing that the commissioners set policy for the port. And then that fair and honest discussion back and forth helps, because you know you're getting all the information that you need to make a decision, and then therefore you can go ahead and make the best policy decision.
One of the things I've seen where executive directors are not long for their position is if they start to favor one commissioner over the other, provide different information. Or if I get an executive director who calls me and says, Frank, I don't need to worry. I have 2 out of the 3 votes. I do. I got them solid. I said, until you don't, then you have 1 out of the 3 votes and your job's over. So they really try and build consensus, and they should be fair, honest brokers to you of information. Same information to all the commissioners. And so you want to ask yourself, and you can talk to somebody like Julie from the Port of Anacortes, how they make sure that all the commissioners get the same information, that there's no favored nations amongst commissioners.
And that's important for you to be able to make a sound policy decision, is you want to be able to know that everybody has that same information, so you have that same playing field to make those decisions. We talked about the delegation of powers resolution that's there. A good rule of thumb is always, if there's a doubt as a staff member, is bring it to the commission for discussion and resolution on that. One of the things that do recommend is to have a regular staff or a regular review of the executive director, and that doesn't necessarily have to be just at the year mark. Periodically throughout, so that you can correct things as things are happening. It's the same as any good HR management thing for employees, is you don't want to catch them off guard when something or when the review comes, that you want to keep talking to them about how you're perceiving that.
I think the biggest single complaint I hear from executive directors is they never tell me how I'm doing. And when you go to the commissioners, what do they say? Oh, we don't need to. They're doing a great job. You know, seriously. I mean, the commissioners say, "Oh, they're doing a great job. We're good," and the executive director says, "I've never had a formal review where they call me in. You can do them in an executive session, so make sure you do a review of your executive director. It forces the commission to focus, but it also provides some guidance for them." And that is the biggest single complaint I get. They never tell me anything. You know, they haven't adjusted my salary. They don't do anything. I can't get them to focus on it. It's not important. They don't want to do it. And so, commissioners, review your executive directors. Yeah. That's your only employee as the commission. You only have one employee, the executive director.
I think some folks look at a review as being a negative. it's not a negative. It's an opportunity to talk about where your priorities are, where are you headed, how are they doing on implementing those priorities. And many times, if you've got your priorities laid out, it's really kind of easy because it's a update of where are we on these priorities? How are we doing on these? Do you need some course correction? Are we learning from these? Do we need to shift in another direction? Or hey, we need some more information on this. So it's a great way to provide that feedback and make sure your priorities are being followed.
If you're not getting a sense of this, what we're telling you is you're the leaders of the port. You are the leaders of the port. You're not, it's not like some staff say, this place would be a lot easier if we didn't have these commissioners to run. You are the leaders of the port. You set the tone and the direction. We'll talk about that. Yeah. Next, we're going to talk about the port auditor. So you only have 3 direct reports to you. You have the executive director, or sometimes they call him a manager in smaller ports. You have the port auditor, and you have the attorney. Okay? Your attorney doesn't get a contract. They serve at your pleasure. They can be fired anytime. Typically, we encourage them to reappoint every year. That's what I usually say. I don't have an answer.
That's the good lawyer answer.
You must be an attorney. No, but the port auditor is a function that is rising in as we think about expanding things. It's usually the port's bookkeeper or CFO in a larger port. By statute, you have to have a port auditor because they have to certify every pay application before it's paid. Before you can approve it, they have to certify it. The goods have been received, the work's been done. They have a statutory duty under the statutes. And I think the best way to say about port auditor and actually port attorney, but particularly port auditors because they're somewhat reticent people. They graduated from being that 25-year-old accountant and got a job in the port, is they serve as a lifeguard at the pool. Their job is to tell you, we're getting out of field here. We're getting where we shouldn't be, okay? So you want to encourage the port auditor to tell you those things. They should feel comfortable with raising issues and involve them early in your projects. Nothing drives an auditor more crazy than you've cooked up this whole project, come to them and say, how do we pay for this? They go, it would have been easier had I been in on the first part of this project. And then the port attorneys, we work for you. We serve the whole commission. We provide legal advice, and we help and select and manage special counsel. It's somewhat of a mistake to have like 5 different law firms, in my opinion. I got my special counsel here. I got this counsel. I hired this counsel. I hired that counsel. Have your lawyer do that because have the lawyer look at the bills, make sure they're reasonable, be accountable to you for that. They represent the port. How can we get this done? It's a kind of a risk analysis. We've been through this. They know the difference between legal advice and business advice. And keep in mind that we tend to be the paid paranoid, okay? We are the person in a room that knows why everything goes bad. That's what we do. I've had developer clients of our law firm say, Frank, I've made millions of dollars disregarding your business advice because you're too paranoid. So we're always the one to say, this could go wrong, that could go wrong, this could go wrong. Of course, that's our job. So understand that, and we can do that. Traits of a good attorney, I think a fair and honest provider of information. If you find an attorney who's not being square with everybody, it's not an extra commissioner or an advocate of a position. We provide the best legal advice possible, even if it's unpopular. Don't shoot the messenger. We're just trying to tell you what's out there. We don't play favorites. We also serve as a lifeguard at the pool. And that's an actual picture of a port auditor and a port attorney right there in the pool. The commissioner's in the back with the yellow thing. And so we're there to protect you. Honestly, people always ask, and I've had this question asked 1,000 times, what do you think about that? If you think about lawyers, we're process people. We care about process. Substantively, I don't care. For the most part, except Bellingham, I don't live in your community. Whatever. If you want my advice, I'll say, well, here's my business advice. But really not much. We don't think much about the substance of the issue. We think about the process because our job is to let you decide the substance. And we add the process to make sure it's successfully completed. Okay?
And that's back to Frank's point at the beginning of when the commission passes something, it's presumed good. So we advise and defend.
Okay, so now we're going to tell you about some legal stuff you ought to know. We're going to go through it quickly because some of this stuff you're going to hear tomorrow. And there's two particular statutes, the Open Public Meetings Act and the Public Records Act, that you need to know. You need to know. Because if you don't know them, you will not live long and prosper as a port commissioner. Okay, so you do need to know those.
So we'll spend more time on this tomorrow morning, so that one of the things is under state law is that new commissioners have to go through training and get certified in both of these subjects. So the training that you'll receive tomorrow morning will accomplish that. So you'll be good. But this is just to hit the highlights. Some of the big things on that, as we talked about, make sure you don't have a quorum. So 3-member commissions, if you talk to another commissioner, you are a quorum, and therefore you have to have an open notice public meeting on it. If you're on a 5-member commission, if you talk to 3, you're there. One of the things to be really careful of is if you get an email update on what's going on, the staff will send you something, or the executive director or somebody will send you something. And if you hit reply all and there's other commissioners on there, that starts a serial meeting on that wasn't open. So be very careful on that. You may even see some folks that will say, do not reply all on the email. It's just to make sure as a reminder that it's not inadvertent when, many of you, most of everybody, it's a part-time job. So you're looking at things and community members and everything, late at night and you're tired. So just a remember of
now,
that.
The executive director can send an email to the 3 commissioners. This is what happened. This is what I think. And each of you can reply back to the executive director and say, here's my view, here's my view, here's my view. You can't reply all. And the executive director can't then send out a subsequent email and say, hey, I heard from everybody and here's what everyone's saying. So he can't be part of the serial meeting chain either. Okay, and there's a bunch of cases on serial meetings and people get in trouble over them, and it's very embarrassing, and so it's not worth the effort, okay? My best story of this is I was sitting in the back of a commission meeting when they were talking about firing an executive director. I'm leaning against the wall with the CFO, the meeting's packed, and the president of the commission, who was a state legislator, so he kind of knew everything and didn't listen, said, well, I just want to say that I met with Commissioner so-and-so at my house, and then we decided what we were going to do, and then he left and Commissioner so-and-so came in, and then we had a further discussion, and the both of us just went, oh, this is not good. What did we do to remedy the problem? Anybody? I want to stand up here so you can see me. We self-reported to the auditor and said, we had a problem, we've done some training, we've cautioned the commissioners, and they never gave an audit finding because kind of recognized the problem and did some training and cured the issue. But as many times we talk, I'll tell you where this comes up, okay? Mark this down. When you want to fire the executive director, this is where open public meetings violations occur. Why? Because I work with the executive directors, so you don't trust me as your lawyer, right? And you don't trust the auditor because the auditor works with the ED. And so you're kind of fumbling around, who can we trust? So you'll do it yourself, okay? And that's where it happens. Trust me, if I don't think I can help you fire your executive director, I'll tell you and get you another lawyer. If I'm too close of a buddy with the executive director. Most of the time I don't like him, happy to fire him for you. So but no, we work with the staff and we like the staff. If we feel we're too close, we have an ethical obligation to say, hey, they're too much of a friend of ours, get somebody else, okay?
That's what we talked about before, about the attorney representing the port as a whole, not the individual. Regularly scheduled meetings, you just set the time, recommend you do it by resolution at the beginning of the year. Our meetings are on the first and third Wednesday at such and such a time and such a location. You're good to go on that. Special meetings, those are things that pop up, and you can have a special meeting. You need to give 24 hours notice. One of the big things about a special meeting is that you can't take any action unless it's actually noticed on there. So that's a big thing too.
So in a regularly scheduled meeting, you can consider anything on or off the agenda. Doesn't matter. It's a regularly scheduled meeting. The theory being the public knows to come to the meeting. I'll tell you an important point about it, and we're going to skim over this because we're going to cover it tomorrow. Eric Johnson, who used to be the executive director of the WPPA, now for the Port of Tacoma, the executive director, said a political thing to consider is you should never take an action that the reasonably informed citizen who's been to all your meetings would surprise them, right? If you pick that perfect citizen who comes at every meeting, sits and listens, and then they show up at the December 5th meeting and you do something, they go, what? That's probably not a good idea. You probably want to do it. Port of Port Townsend has 2 readings before they pass anything. So they read it once and they bring it back, which is kind of interesting, kind of like a city model. But in any event, think about the purpose. So in a regularly scheduled meeting, you can do anything you want. The special meetings, you're limited to what you notice the meeting for. Les, why don't we go through skip over it because they're going to hear it again.
We'll hear about we'll go into more depth
I know the
tomorrow.
WPPA said tell the commissioners twice, but once is probably enough.
We want to,
Yeah, you do. This is a wonderful country, isn't it?
yeah. Do you want to hit?
Let's talk about some thoughts about open meetings, and this is a little bit different. You're not legally required to take public comment, okay? Now, everybody does. Everybody's port, I'm sure, takes public comment. It's not a debate. It's a chance for comment. Because if you get into a discussion or a debate, what happens? The next person stands up, and then you don't want to talk about that. And then they say, what? You just talked to that person? You won't talk to me? And it rapidly gets out of hand. So you have to say, this is your opportunity to comment to us, okay? And be respectful of the public always. The best one I ever saw was a port commissioner who was a World War II Marine Corps pilot, who was a veteran. And a member of the citizens got up and called him a liar, and he was a Marine. So he said, let's take a recess, and you and I will step outside and settle this like 2 men. You called me a liar. Probably not a good idea, commissioners. Don't want to be called, okay. And you impose a soft time limit. But keep in mind, you set the tone, commissioners. If you're in commission meetings, and I've been to them where the commission's arguing and calling each other liars and yelling, then you set the tone. You set the tone of these commission meetings. It's your port, it's your tone, it's your culture. You're there to lead, okay? So if you thought this was just a technical job, and you have special knowledge about real estate or about shipping or airlines or something, that's not why the port needs you. They need you to be a leader. Okay? And the last one is the political bank account. The political bank account is a term that is battered around ports to say it's the bank account of everything you've done well. Okay? You build up a good political bank account, and you want to, Port of Bellingham wanted to buy the Georgia Pacific pulp and tissue mill, which would be the equivalent of, at the time, the Port of Seattle spending $5 billion. The public said, fine. If you have a bad political bank account because you don't run your meetings very well or you get in fights and stuff, the public won't trust you to do anything. So keep in mind you always have that political bank account. You want to really build that up for the big things that you want the public to support you on. Okay? Go ahead. We're going to get into this, create a plan for controversial issues. We'll talk about that. But public hearings are sometimes required. You know, you call in experts to show your homework. You call in an expert on economic development. You call somebody from the local Chamber of Commerce to talk about your plan. You call somebody from the shipping industry to say how this improvement will really help industrial development. Fiber optics. All those ports went through a big thing about, hey, if we had fiber optic to our ports, that would be a big deal for our economies if we get fiber optic to our port facilities. So let's do that as an economic development tool. You look in the statute, there's no fiber optic in the statute. It's economic development. Go ahead. So, thoughts on open public meeting. Controversial issues with large attendees. We call that cooking in a hot kitchen. Does anybody know where this is from? This picture? Nobody? No movie buffs?
Frankenstein.
Frankenstein, it's the public coming to get Frankenstein, okay? So sometimes there's port meetings like this where the torches are lit and they're coming to your port, okay? Go ahead. Now, I feel bad for port commissioners. I sit there and I feel like sometimes the port commissioners are 3 sheep led into the room and the public is just angry, and they're coming to tell you. And every time you know this is going to happen, it's not like, oh, we didn't think anybody's going to show up to our port meeting today. When these controversial issues come, you know they're coming. And so plan ahead on how you will unfold this meeting, right? How will we conduct this meeting, okay? How are we going to do this, okay? And then introduce the issue to the public. Don't just say, okay, we'll take public comment, and then you got a whole bunch of people. You don't say, you know, an issue is this. I'll tell you a common one, Bellingham, noise at the airport. This is a big issue. The commission says we have to balance the economic development of the airport with our neighbors' noise issues. It's our job to listen and try and make our best decision. Right, now we've introduced the issue, and so now the public is speaking to the issue. You also get a large enough room, okay? If you have a lot of crowd, move to a bigger facility. If you don't have a big enough facility, get an interlocal with the local city to use their facility, okay? So I've seen the smallest meeting room of ports I've ever seen is the port of Poulsbo. Anybody here? No new commissioners? And you have a floating meeting room. They have a barge with a roof. Most of the time it floats until you fill it up with the people with the torches. And so you want a bigger room so they can sit back and say, okay, let's all bring the temperature down a little bit. If you ever go to federal court, and if any of you have been to federal court, they have these huge benches way up high in big rooms. It's to set the majesty of the scene. And I'm not saying do that, but I'm saying it really lowers the tone compared to a real tight courtroom where everybody's on top of each other. And reference a community standard. You know, here in Poulsbo, we don't do personal attacks. Our community standard. Don't say the port standard, because they're going to say, well, we hate your port standard. No, here in Poulsbo, we have a community standard. We treat each other with respect. We may be all Vikings, but we treat each other with respect. So let's do that. And then thank everyone. So as everyone comments, thank you. And you know what? If you have to be there 3 hours to take comments, be there 3 hours to take comments. So my point to you is when you're going to cook in a hot kitchen, don't be like the three sheep led in there and say, this sounds like, because it's very uncomfortable to watch when the commission hasn't planned ahead on how we're going to make this decision. You might say to the public, we're going to take public comment today, we're going to take it 2 weeks from now, and then we're going to make a decision after that, or something like that. And if you treat the public with respect, my experience is they'll treat you with respect. Right? So there you go.
Yeah. From a practical standpoint, the commission president and the executive director and likely the attorney should sit down ahead of time, kind of role play some of these things. What happened if signs show up and there are people behind that can't see anything because they have all these signs going? How are you going to handle those kinds of things? We'll talk more about this stuff tomorrow, but those are things to plan out ahead of time.
Okay, so this is the third rail of politics and this is public records. And this is all, and Les will go into this tomorrow, all port documents, electronic records. So every one of you should have a device provided by your port to take port documents. You should not be taking them on your own computer. Okay? You should not be taking them on your own computer. Because then we may have to search your home computer looking for public records. One port commissioner from Montana who lived in Washington told me, you'll only be able to pry my home computer from my cold dead fingers at the time. He was not going to turn his over. And so you have to be really careful what is a public record. And keep in mind, virtually everything you do is a public record, okay? So, how many of you blog? We have port commissioners have a blog. Any tweets? Are you a tweeter? Do you tweet? Where are you from? What port? Oh, see, there you go. High Tech, Seattle, they tweet. Most port commissioners don't, but if you tweet, those have to be captured, right? You're treating on port business. There's a way to do that. We had a port commissioner in Bellingham who tweeted, and then they captured it. Facebook posts. How many have Facebook posts related to the port? There you go. There's a public record. Cell phone records and cell phone photos. You know, if you have a port provided cell phone, or if you take, we had a big fire in one port, and a bunch of port staff took pictures, and they wanted all the cell phones and went through them and get all the pictures out, and some people are pretty uncomfortable about turning over their phones. So we'll go through that. Go ahead. Do you want me to do it, or you can go ahead?
Sure. Just as Frank was saying, that the records need to be preserved. So if you are using Facebook and those things, talk to the staff, make sure that they know, the executive director, they'll have ways of doing that. One of the things that we talk about, and we're at the legal seminar next door talking about this, is that the courts are getting more and more result oriented. So they kind of say, okay, here's what we want the result to be, and we'll figure out a way to get there. What that means is that the Public Records Act is continuing to expand what is a public record and so forth. So just best rule is, if anything you write, just imagine it being on the front page of whatever the paper is that you're at. That's the best advice, and think through that. Maybe don't hit send or post or whatever for a couple minutes, and come back to it. Those kinds of things are good on that.
What's happened now too is, let me just say that there's been this confluence, in my view, of technology, the Public Records Act, and litigation. So now we have people come and say, give me the hard drive for the Port of Bellingham, and I will use my software to look through the hard drive to find the records that are appropriate to this. And you say, no, you're not getting a hard drive, but okay, well, here's some search terms we want you to look at. And this software has gotten pretty cheap, and so now you see expanding public records requests. It's actually easier to get, if you have litigation with an agency, easier to use the Public Records Act than use the litigation process, because you can get such a broad sweep, and then you can search it. You can buy that software now for $3,500 to search through all the emails, and it's intuitive. It gets better and better the more often you ask it a question. And so all of a sudden now we have these huge public records requests. By the way, does anybody know what the #1 agency in the state for public records requests is? Anybody? The Department of Corrections. All the prisoners sit around in prison and issue public records requests. What has our Supreme Court said? You have to honor them. So all of those records are first produced, then they go to the prison, and a person in the prison screens them to see under prison rules whether the prisoners can see them. But they have a huge budget in Department of Corrections to look at public records from prisoners. Okay, so if you're bored in prison, you can make public records requests. Okay, and let's point it out that, avoid obviously any jokes. Colloquial speech. I say think not once but twice before you push the send button. And your port should have a retention policy and stick to it. How long do we hold records? Okay, there's rules for the state archivists that let you do that.
Yes, sir.
We dealt here with technology. What about the old way? What do we have to keep? What's draft? What's disclosed?
So is that in the system of port records? Or is that just your personal notes?
My personal notes, I think, like right here, I think the notes of this meeting which relates to the board.
Okay, so I would tell you right now, and we haven't talked about this, I would tell you I don't think it's a public record. But I bet if somebody sued, the Supreme Court would hold it to be a public record.
I think best practices, regardless of, I think we both agree on whether it is or isn't, but you're going to get somebody who can get their attorney's fees, so it's worth them to challenge it. So best practice would be just make sure if you're keeping port notes, you keep them in a separate notebook.
Not one provided by the port.
Yeah.
Not one you leave at your desk at the port. One that's your personal recollections, okay? But keep in mind that's even somewhat, I would predict the Supreme Court would hold it to be a public record. I would.
I've been affected by this because rules have had for a long time. What I've previously been told years ago was if it's draft, it's not disclosable.
No.
It sounds like it's changed.
But there are ways, there's the deliberative process exemption, which we'll talk a little bit about tomorrow, where if it's a pre-decisional thought process and things, you can do that. But once that decision's made, then it becomes disclosable at that point.
Yeah.
So. Same thing on what? I'm
Yes.
sorry? Oh. Yeah.
Yeah, but keep in mind we're a two-party consent state, so everybody's got to consent to you recording it. Well, we always take the position your notes are not public records, but if they were, it would apply.
Well, if you don't have
Throw them away once a year.
that's what I was gonna say, if you don't have a standing public records request for your notes or something of that nature, and, you take down some notes here and you go back and you translate to whatever you do, you can just throw that away.
Yeah.
And,
So here's some exemptions, and we'll talk about those tomorrow, and I think we've covered that. So now, public records. How many of you have a harbor or a marina or something in your port? What if your harbor master said this to you? It'd be a lot easier if we didn't have any boaters in our marina, I mean, we could keep it clean, the equipment wouldn't break down, and you would say, no, that's what we do. Well, likewise, we hear people say, next slide there, Les, it's really a pain. It's interfering with my job here. I'm being quite honest with you. The way you have to look at a public records request is what you do. It's, for those of you who've been around a while, it's your Nordstrom opportunity, okay, to provide great public records service. Once you get it in your mind that it's an interference with government, then you don't react properly to it. You wouldn't put up with your harbor master saying that, and so you have to think of public records as it's one of the primary functions of government. And so what good ports do is they track a public records budget. They get a report usually the CFO says we've had X number of public records requests on a quarterly basis, so you know where it's going. You know how much money you spent on it. It's part of your budget. Because it's every bit of the function is running the airport, is running the shipping terminal, is running the marina, is running the boat launch, is providing public records. It is a core function of government. And I think if you read the Supreme Court decisions, that's what they always try and tell. The one that gets hit a lot is King County gets hit and stuff, and you can just hear that they just are resistive to that concept, okay?
And it starts, we'll talk more about this, but it starts at the top, coming down. And so when you get a request, having the executive director or somebody sit down with everybody and saying, okay, here's what we're going to do, here's our plan, it's important.
There you go. Well, we already told you that. Now, code of ethics for municipal employees, okay? Yes, sir.
I just have a quick question about the no report document. What if you have a separate email account that you only do your board business?
If your port can't afford an iPad for you or a laptop or something, I suppose you can do that, but it is dangerous because you are allowed to do this, though. You are allowed to say, my standard practice is only to have port business conducted on my port email account. I have searched that account, and here's the documents. You can do that, but I think it's better practice is to have a separate device, okay?
Yeah.
And then I'll tell you, when a constituent writes you and you're going to respond, because they'll send you an email on your own account, CC your port email address so it wraps into the system, right? Because that's a public record.
Yeah, anytime you always CC your port address, because then it'll be in the system, and then you can say, we searched, and my standard practice is that I always CC, so then you know where it is, so you can kind of resist them grabbing your personal.
So this is a very bad statute. This is a very poorly worded statute. This is a code of ethics for municipal employees. It prevents you from having a contract interest, okay? But Washington is a minority state. By that I mean it doesn't follow all the other states. And we say that you cannot have a direct or indirect interest at the time you vote. Now everybody knows, because we watch enough TV, that you say, hey, this is my brother-in-law's company, I'm going to recuse myself from voting. That does not work in Washington. If you have a contract interest, you either have to quit the commission or eliminate the contract interest. But the trick is they define contract interests very narrowly and only to the time you vote. So here's an example, true example. You are in the business of building steel buildings. And steel buildings make great hangars for small airplanes. And somebody comes to you and says, I'd like to lease some property at your port to build a hangar. And the three of you vote, and you as the commissioner say, I'd like to take a break, And you go out and you go up to that person and say, hey, I'm Commissioner Jones. I build steel buildings. How about hiring my company? Not a problem. You've already taken the vote. Not a problem. Now, I'm telling you law. Politics is up to you. May not be the best idea, right? Now, same thing where you got together and you've already contractually committed to build all the hangars for this person. He comes to your port and says, I want a lease. You now have a problem. The seminal case is out of Pierce County. It was a guy who was on the city council, and he had the only gravel pit. And the city had a contract with his gravel pit to produce gravel, long-standing contract. He said, I'm not going to get involved in it. I'm not going to do anything with it. And our court said, no. You either get rid of the gravel pit or get it off the council. But what happens is it's misperceived by the public a lot, right? So the public thinks it's much bigger than it is. An example, and here's how you deal with it. If you think it has an appearance politically, you think it doesn't look good, then you ask the lawyer, right, in the meeting, or we attend a lot of meetings now via Skype is gone. It's now Microsoft meetings, team meetings or something. Anyway, we attend meetings, and we're there. Or a lot of times your port attorneys there say, listen, this is my brother-in-law's company. That's not a conflict. The lawyer says, that's not a conflict. And you say, yeah, but out of an abundance of caution, I'm not going to vote. Okay? So you, again, showing your homework to the public, because people misperceive how broad the statute is. Very narrow. We had a port commissioner at Port of Bellingham who was an employee of British Petroleum, had a big refinery up in Bellingham. And we would do industrial development bond funding, which is a whole other thing you'll learn about. And it was for the benefit of BP. And he would say, every time, I'm an employee of BP. Can I vote? And I would say, well, Mr. Commissioner, if you own more than 1% of British Petroleum, then you can't vote because the statute excludes that. And he would say, well, if I own more than 1% of British Petroleum, I wouldn't be sitting here, number one. And then he would go on to say, but I'm not going to vote. Every time. So think of the perception versus the reality. The reality is very narrow, but the perception is much broader. So you have to manage the perception, is my point.
Best practice on that is from what's going to be on the agenda, whether that's going to pop up, and just call the executive director and or the attorney and say, hey, here's what's going on. Then you already have thought about this and you know what's going to happen and what's going to be said, so you're prepared.
No matter what you hear in an executive session, you cannot disclose confidential information. It's not only for personal gain, that's not accurate. It's disclosure information or use of it for personal gain. So what you hear in executive session, no matter how much you want to go out and tell somebody, you cannot disclose it, okay? It's actually a violation of the Ethics in Municipal Government Act. It leads to a monetary fine, and it could lead to forfeiture of your office. So don't talk about what happens in executive sessions, okay? And we talked about the political bank account. So we just talked about that. Other issues to consider. This is where commissioners, I had a commissioner once, and they had pulled some old piling out of a saltwater marina, the old creosote pilings. And they stacked them up at the airport because that was the only open ground they had to stack them while they were waiting to get rid of them. Okay? And he thought that, if he took one of those old, and they were going to have to pay to get rid of them. He thought if he took one of those old pilings, kind of cut it up into uniform pieces, he could line his garden, like his planter with it. I'm not commenting on his gardening design idea, but he thought, what the hell? And he pulled his pickup truck in there and cut them, and he had a port guy help him load them in the back of the truck, and off he goes. Big political stink. We didn't realize those pilings were made out of solid gold until the port commissioner took them, right? Because all of a sudden, they were worth something, okay? So even though we were going to have to dispose of them, all that, the public didn't care. A person who didn't like that port commissioner, didn't like the port, said, oh, you stole port property, okay? If you have comments about the next one, Les, go ahead. Let's hit the next.
The next slide.
Yeah.
Yeah, the public funds, public stuff, it all comes down to this appearance again. One of the things where people do get in trouble is there's surplusing. There's a laptop or something that the commissioner was using and they're want to use it. They just want to keep doing it. So make sure you have policies on that. You're asking procurement and whoever does that for your port that whatever that policy is on that, because there's an appearance of conflict of interest on that. You see that'll pop up where there'll be like a property sticker on it or something, and somebody says, hey, wait a second, what are you doing at Starbucks using that? You're not a commissioner anymore, or something of that nature. So
Yeah, or you think you're gonna go buy the surplus property and bid on it as a commissioner, or your child is. Or your child's gonna work at the summer on the marinas, right? Because you hire summer workers. Why not? My college-age kid could help out. Well, you're a port commissioner, and you just gotta be careful, because everyone's out there with cell phones, and you all seen it. Yeah. And they're going to do something about it. So,
one of the big takeaways from that is just because legally you may be able to do it doesn't mean that you want to do it. And those are two different analyses on that.
I always say that by saying I legally could have showed up here in capri stretch pants. That would not make it a good idea. Okay, so think about that. So I've locked that in your mind.
Do we want to think about that?
So every time it comes up, it goes, oh no, this is not going to be a capri stretch pants moment, right? I'm gonna make sure that I'm gonna think about this. Okay. When I was in the Army, the Judge Advocate General of the Army, a 2-star general, and Les is a 1-star Judge Advocate Admiral. The Army had a policy that said you turned your mileage over to the Army. And he decided he was going to keep his mileage.
Airline mileage.
Airline mileage, because he has to fly around and visit places. Because he wanted to take his wife with him to Korea. And it was discovered. I don't know what he saved. What a ticket to Korea is maybe a couple $1,000s. The U.S. Senate reduced him from 2-star to 1-star when he retired. It probably cost him close to $1 million in retirement. So don't be picking up nickels as a port commissioner, okay? It's just not, don't be very careful with all of your stuff. It's not that much money.
I have a question, case, in my case, I think I've decided what to do, but I'll run by it. So my term as PUD commissioner ended at the end of 2018, and I've been a commissioner for some time. Now I've become a port commissioner.
Okay? Got it.
I can't have an unbiased opinion, so I just said I'm not going to vote in terms of the court's position on this.
How many think that's the right decision? I do. I think you disclose it. Show your homework. Look, it would be improper for me because I understand the PUD's thinking. I know what's behind it. It's the reason we can't represent 2 parties to the same transaction, right? So, except we recently had a port district and a fire district. Fire district provide fire protection to the airport, and the fire chief and the airport director came in. And I said, I can't represent either of you because I represent both of you. I'll just do the agreement, for free because you guys kind of have it worked out. Whereupon they said, free? They both put their feet up and said, get the coffee pot. We're going to be here a while. So. But no, I think you're exactly right. I think you say, but show your homework is what I'm trying to say. Okay?
Yeah. In my humble estimation, everybody here ran because you want to do something good, and you don't want to get distracted by something, where somebody says, oh, the PUD, you disclose something to the port to give them an advantage, and it totally distracts things. And so.
Okay?
And I'm assuming it's not appropriate for me to use my relation to the CEO to broker a deal behind the scenes.
No, actually, that's not bad. If you talk to the executive director, and he says, why don't you and I go talk to the PUD manager, see if we can work something out. I mean, you got your personal ethics here of saying, I'm not going to tell you what was behind the PUD's thinking, but, I know you, Bill, or Joan, can we work something out?
And bring the port executive director with you so you've got, there's not that appearance.
Right, and by the way, the executive director is going to say, I'm planning to go talk to the PUD with Commissioner Smith, let the other 2 commissioners know. There was a question here about speaking for the port. You cannot speak for the port, okay? But it's very appropriate to preserve your political bank account that you go out and speak. You go to Rotaries, you go to Kiwanis clubs, you go to Chamber of Commerce. Most of the time the staff will produce a PowerPoint for you. You talk about issues, but you always say, I'm not here to speak on behalf of my fellow commissioners. I'm here, this is one commissioner's perspective, or this PowerPoint's from the staff. Because how would you like it if you're a commissioner and you read in the paper that the port's doing this initiative and you go, wait a minute, I didn't vote on that. And it was a misspoken statement by one of the port commissioners. So be respectful. Again, you want to have those meetings where you're all respectful of each other, okay, so that things flow, so that you don't get in fights with commissioners.
And one caveat on that, when you go out, if it's an election year, make sure you check in with staff to make sure you're not going to be perceived as using port stuff for election purposes. So it's good just to check in and make sure.
Sexual harassment, oh, let's go back. Sexual harassment, don't do it, okay? It's perceived, it's a subjective view of the person receiving the harassment, so it's whatever they believe. Don't do it. Times have changed, okay? Times have changed. Back in 1987, there was a port commissioner who would walk down the hall to Port of Bellingham. The staff would come out, the women's staff, he'd kiss each staff member, hug them and kiss them, and then he would put in a thing, he did, check in on port, he'd put in a thing for the day, so, got paid. Just steer clear of all of that. It's the third rail to get in trouble, okay? You all know it, if, just be really super careful, okay? All right, so this is a representation of this element here. You're the governance element of the port. You only, other than the lawyer and the auditor, you only interface with the executive director. Let the executive director manage the port, okay? What do you do if the executive director is not managing the port? You go to the bullpen, right? It's the manager comes out and he gives a signal and a new pitcher comes in, right? You get rid of the executive director. The solution is not what we call the command performance syndrome, where you go around the executive director and say, I can organize this. I myself as a commissioner can organize this. Because when you do it, what happens next? The other commissioner says, well, if you're going to do it, I can do it. And then the third commissioner's doing it, and all is lost. So let the executive director manage your staff. I don't know.
And that allows you to stay at the strategic level, which is where you need to be, is providing the vision of where the port's going to be, and then the minutia of the day-to-day stuff that the executive director can take care of. And then you're monitoring them and reporting back to them.
That's not to say you can't talk to staff, but you work that out, what that protocol is with the executive director. Hey, when I wander down a hall, and most executive directors tell staff, if we get a contact from commissioners, we call the executive director, let them know. Commissioner Smith stopped into the real estate department, asked about a lease. So the executive director can do what? Make sure the issue goes to all 3 commissioners or all 5 commissioners or all 6 commissioners.
Everybody's working off the same information.
So, show of hands here real quick. How many of you are going to devote between 1 and 10 hours per month for the port? Okay? 10 to 20 hours. Okay? 20 to 30 hours a month. Okay? How about over 30 hours a month? Anybody? Wow. Okay. So, here's the deal. We can buy as many executive directors as we want and staff. We can buy equipment. We can rent space. We can get every resource for a port except one, your time. We cannot get more of your time because we can't get more commissioners. The law only allows 3 commissioners, sometimes 5, and 6 for the Seaport Alliance, right? Is there 6? I'm not sure. 5 Seaport Alliance. So the combined port of Chelan Douglas now there's 6, and Seaport's 10. Yeah. Right. So we can't get any more of that time. And if you waste that time down in the minutia, we never get the strategic thinking back. It's gone. We just can't find it anymore. And so a lot of what ports try and do is streamline your processes to get you to the big questions, okay? And I'll tell you this. The default position for you commissioners is to get to the not so big questions because they're easy. They're immediate. where is the Seattle Seaport Alliance going to be in 20 years? There's no curb lines. That's a hard question. Where's your port going to be? Should you be combining with another port right now because you're going to run out of money? Or where are we going to be in 10 years? Those are the big questions.